Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You ever wondered why neighborhoods that are predominantly African American have limited resources, like underperforming schools or no extracurriculums, such as no organized sports or no after school programs? Or that African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate as white Americans? I'll tell you why. Systemic racism. Systemic racism is a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. Today, you'll learn how criminal justice, unemployment, and redlining are all affected by systemic racism. First, I'll discuss how criminal justice plays a major role in systemic racism. Studies have shown that African Americans are consistently targeted and punished more aggressively than white Americans. For example, although whites and blacks engage in drug offenses, possession, and sales at roughly a comparable rate, African Americans are arrested 2 to 11 times higher than white Americans. According to the article entitled, Finally, an Explanation of Systemic Racism That Won't Put You to Sleep, by Janae Desmond Harris, dated April 23rd, 2015, it states, and I quote, 40% of drug arrests are not for selling any drugs, but just for possession of marijuana, and that blacks and whites equally like marijuana, but blacks are 3 times as more likely to be arrested than whites, end quote. Systemic racism doesn't end there. African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at 5 times the imprisonment of whites. Incarceration just doesn't claim the freedom of a black man. It also creates a lot of restrictions that hinders an African American growth in life, like equal opportunity in employment and housing instability. Next, I will discuss how employment is being tarnished by systemic racism. Did you know that America, black unemployment has been twice as higher than whites in unemployment? Even the college graduates are unemployment is twice as much as white college graduates. Here's why. Applicants with a white sounding name are 50% more likely to receive an interview than a person with a black sounding name. According to an article entitled Open Wide Our Hearts by John Paul, dated March 12, 2020, it states, and I quote, all too often, African Americans are faced discrimination in hiring, housing, educational opportunities, and incarceration, end quote. Hiring discrimination against African Americans still a reality and has not declined in the past 25 years. Next, I will review how redlining has been a part of systemic racism for decades. But first, let's view a short video that elaborates on systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining. and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s,
The ideal of redlining in America refers to the practice of financial institutions, defined specifically for neighborhoods or areas on a map less desirable to lend to. The neighborhoods are usually occupied by people in certain social economic groups, likely those with low income rate or a certain color of race. According to the article entitled Redlining, Origin Story of Institutional Racism by Michael Harriot, dated April 25th, 2019, it states, and I quote, about 36% of education funds come from property taxes. These lower home values, which were a direct result of redlining, means that schools in black neighborhoods receive less funding, end quote. Now, let's review what we've discussed today. Systemic racism has been among African Americans for centuries now, with no signs of letting up. It starts with the criminal justice system that gives us a criminal record. From there, our criminal record prevents us from obtaining a reliable job, a fair shot at equal opportunity in employment. Now, without the proper funding through employment, we have no real chance of obtaining housing or a thriving school district for our children to attend. I chose this topic to embrace the challenges that African Americans face each and every day. And by doing so, I've learned that although slavery was abolished in 1865, racism still exists in many forms. The history of America's flaws is something that I hope the audience walk away with today. Thank you.